working on the intake manifold setup. We're going to go ahead and replace them with brand new gaskets. And I wanted to show you real quick when doing this on this Northstar engine. This intake gasket sets are actually held on by clips. So all you do is you're going to pull that back and the thing pretty much pops off. Like so. See how it just pops right off? That is your intake gasket right there. And what you want to do is you want to make sure your surfaces are clean. So we're going to go ahead and clean that up with some B12 carburetor cleaner. Do the same on that side. And then go ahead and pop the new gaskets in place. But at the same time, before installing it, you want to make sure you get the surface up here as well before we go ahead and torque down the intake. Of course, when we go ahead and torque it down, you're looking at 89 inch-pounds. All these bolts. So you got 5 on this side, and you got 5 on this side. Of course, you start in the center and work yourself outwards like an X. So make sure you get your battery cable back on the starter. Run it around. Of course, battery cable has its bends from the previously when you go to remove it, so it's pretty simple, self-explanatory when you go to reinstall it. And then of course, the other wire goes down to your alternator down here. So 13 millimeter, tight, snug it on there, snug it on here. Don't over torque it, or you'll strip the threads on the starter or the alternator. We're gonna go ahead and the surfaces have already been cleaned on the head, so we're gonna pop these, get this all cleaned up, and then we'll go ahead and pop it on there and torque those bolts down. Alright, just completed installing the intake with the new intake manifold gasket set in place. Of course, these bolts, there's 5 on both sides. So start from the center. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Torquing these at 89 inch-pounds. So once you get that torqued, went ahead and moved along to the back side where the shift mechanism goes. Went ahead and rebolted down the plate. It's held on by these 2 bolts, 13 millimeter. And of course, this is the lever for the shifter. These are remaining bolts. Go ahead and reinstall. This is the shift selector, the electronic component that goes on the transmission itself. So of course you can see pretty much goes on like so. It's held on by those 2 bolts. One right here, one right here. And after that's down, then we'll go ahead and pop this lever back on for the shifter. And then once that is in place, we'll move on to the electric components, start wrapping it around the motor and transmission as it should, along with the exhaust. So we got to get that white pipe, that pipe right here, mounted back on there. And these bolts, of course, 20 foot-pounds. All these bolts are bolted on to the flange gaskets, or the flanges. And then once we get that done, we'll move on to any vacuum, the fuel system, whatnot that's on top of the intake, followed by the timing cover. So we got to go ahead and get that timing cover, get this ground. Any grounds, make sure you remount all your grounds. It is very important to ensure that the motor transmission starts and computer is read correctly. Not enough ground, it won't start. So. Alright, went ahead and installed the white pipe that's on the back side of this engine. These are 15 millimeter bolts right here. These are 10 millimeter. Just pulled them in. This bracket assembly that mounts around the EGR valve. 13 millimeter with the ground wire, of course, and then it runs along onto the side of the head with these 2 bolts right here, and then another bracket runs down to the transmission. So that's 18 millimeter. These are 15 millimeter bolts. The bolts themselves are 15 back here, and then the nuts on top are 15 as well. So I went ahead and pulled that in. Then I went ahead and started sticking the harness on the motor. Got a little carried away, but just ran the harness around and up underneath the mass airflow sensor, came around, mass airflow sensor connector, idle air control valve, throttle positioning sensor connectors, your map sensor, and then all of your fuel injectors. Of course, it runs underneath, goes around your intake to the other side, and then stops at the last injector back here. So remember, all these connectors, you just push. There's no need to remove them, the metal clips, the little metal clips. They just snap in there, or you squeeze it. See how it moves? Push it, and it pops right out. All right, so make sure your harness also sits in original location, so it's nice and tucked away, not in the way of anything. You also have a ground wire that sits right here that's mounted over here by a 10mm bolt. Make sure you get that ground as well. Grounds are very important. All right? So moving along, with all that being done, now it's time to go ahead and do this. But while I was back here, this little guy right here is in a very hard area that's on the motor assembly. So I would recommend going to your parts store and buying a new hose. It's a heater hose connector. And what goes bad in them is this little rubber ring inside that's inside there. That thing's full of rust. You can kind of see that? So you can't even tell that the seal is pretty much there anymore. I would recommend replacing this because it's in the hard area. It sits right back here, and then it hooks into this little metal pipe. So that metal pipe goes in there, and then it runs to the top. All right, so make sure you go ahead and it's only like $8, $7 at your parts store. Get a new one. That way you save yourself the trouble later on. But we'll go ahead and put this connector in now, and then we'll move on to the ignition control module along with all the spark plugs. So you can go to the parts store, get yourself some new AC Delco plugs or whatever brand you recommend, gap them the manufacturer recommendation, pop them in there. I went ahead and popped the original ones back in place using anti-seize on the threads, and dielectric grease we'll be using on the boots themselves. We'll go putting it back together. But I'm gonna go ahead and put this box back on and then button up a few more electrical connectors. I'm gonna wait on this exhaust pipe that sits right here until I get the new hose connector. It goes right there. Had to order it. All right, as we go into installing the new gasket for the timing cover, you can purchase any brand gasket you prefer, but today I'm going to be installing a Fail Pro one, which is your part number, and this gasket is pretty much clean the surface, pop the new gasket in place, go ahead and get your cover, pop it on there, and then we're going to torque down these bolts to 89 inch-pounds all the way around. But before installing the cover, you want to ensure you replace your harmonic balancer seal, which in this case I went ahead and installed a National 710555, which you can interchange that part number at any local parts store if they don't have this brand to what brand they do have. But for the gasket, you're going to pop it out from the backside, and then to install the new one, what I did is I just went ahead and got a exhaust pipe that is an identical size, and pretty much popped it in with the hammer. So I laid it across there and tapped it in until the gasket is flush. So now that the seal has been installed on the cover, ensure that your surface is still clean, that there's no debris, and then we'll go ahead and pop the cover on with the gasket in place. Install all your 10mm bolts, and then torque them down to 89 inch-pounds. All right, went ahead and after completed the timing cover installation and following the procedures of torquing these bolts down at 89 inch-pounds all the way around, it was then time to go ahead and install the harmonic balancer. I went ahead and cleaned the surface, make sure it was good for the seal, and then popped it on there. I barely just tapped it a few times with a 2x4 and a hammer to pull it pretty much almost all the way in, and then I tighten this bolt up, and it pulled itself all the way. But once you're up, once you feel the harmonic balancer touch the backside or where the oil pump sits, you want to go ahead and torque this down to 37 foot-pounds, and then after you do that, you got to go 120 degrees afterwards to complete the torquing procedure on a harmonic balancer. Then after that, went ahead and replaced or installed the bolts on the compressor. You got the 3 bolts down here, 15mm bolts. Put the idler pulley back on, and the belt tensioner. Of course, on the head, there's these little indentions in which the pulley sits. 13mm bolt, snugged it on there. You got this bracket right here that's held on, 15mm bolt, but on the bracket, you got a little lip that sits right on the inside. So you want to make sure you get it in the lip area so this doesn't flex when you go lifting it. This is the lifting point. So when you pull the engine, and it pretty much is held on the lip by this head, and so it doesn't turn when you go lifting this vehicle or this engine if you do use this lift point. You have the little bracket that sits right here. It's got 3 holes with the 3 bolts. You can't forget this ground strap. All right, that's an important deal. Get that ground strapped on, snug, tight, and then after that, it is then safe to go ahead and install your cover or this bracket. This is part of your engine mount. So of course you got the top side, sits up on top, mounts there. You have one that goes over here on the lower part, and you can't forget this. This is your power steering pressure hose. Yeah, there's a little bolt. If you remember early at the beginning of the video, we removed that bolt. So it's a little baby bolt, like 7mm, 8mm bolt. Go ahead and make sure you put that back on there so it's not wobbling around. Causes a hole in the hose after hitting this multiple times. You want to make sure it's just out of the way. And then we'll go ahead and you got to put the nut here, the bolt there, long bolt. You have 1 bolt right here. These right here stay clear because of the engine mount. This is where the engine mount sits onto the frame. So I'm gonna go ahead and put them bolts in. Then it is done and complete on this side. And we're just waiting on what parts we have left on the backside of the heater hose connector. And then it's ready to go up into the motor or into the engine bay of the vehicle. All right, you wanna go ahead and before you go stabbing it inside the vehicle, you want to go ahead and just go over your work one more time, especially in the hard areas, like this bracket right here. It's held on the side of the transmission or on the side of the head. 15mm bolts. You have the 2 bolts right here and the top one right here. Down here talks about that heater connector right there. It's easy to go ahead and replace it right now since you have it out instead of putting in the old one. Of course, the old one right here, and you can get it at your local parts store. That's the part number, the Dorman. It's quick. Pop the old one out. Rust inside. The rubber boots bad. So I went ahead and popped it on right there, and then you have that little that sits right here, 13mm bolt. Go ahead and reinstall this tube right here. It's a 13 right there, and tighten it up. Let's see what else. Go ahead and get your any electrical that's loose lying around. Make sure it's hooked up. You have your heater bolts right here. Get those put in before stabbing this motor. On the thermostat, I would recommend cleaning the surface right here so it's a nice smooth surface. When you go put the new one, you ain't got no problem with any leaks. Bracket, 10mm bolts. Pop that on there, and you have the 1 bolt right here. Other than that, pretty sure we went over everything else. I'm going to go ahead and pop this engine back inside the car, and then we'll finish up by putting the electricals, AC, the exhaust back on pretty quick. Should be maybe 3 more hours of work, and this should be done and over with. I just got the motor and transmission reinstalled in the vehicle. Of course, you can look at this kind of a contraption I have here. This is using 4 or 3 cables tied around the motor and the K-member. So the K-member is being supported the motor is being supported. You want to ensure that the straps that you're using are rated to lift this motor and transmission assembly. And pretty much you're going to need a jack and a cherry picker again to go ahead and get this thing back in its cradle. And it's 18mm bolts. Those bolts that are mounted, like you got six bolts, one here, and you have 2 in the rear right there. Same goes with the other side. Of course, when you go to lifting the motor, you can't forget about that bolt that goes in the rack and pinion right here. All right, I know it's kind of dark, but there's a 13mm bolt that goes on there on the shaft joint. So make sure you get that on there before you actually bolt this down. It makes it a whole lot easier because the shaft actually slides out enough where you can actually get the bolt on and then lift the K-member into its place, making it easy. So I'm gonna go ahead and detach the straps. You can see it around the K-member right there. I'm gonna go ahead and detach the straps, pull it out, and then we'll get started with the suspension, put it all back together. Get the coolant fans back on, shout the hose, any hoses down here, the fuel lines. Got to get the little electrical connectors right there on. And now that we got the motor and transmission bolted up to the vehicle itself, those are 18mm bolts. You got the 6 that hold the K-member up to the body itself. Once those are tight, it's pretty much start with anything that is close to the motor. Try to hammer that stuff out first before working yourself outwards. So you're looking at, like, you want to get down here, get that transmission, the connector itself that's on the back side, get that hooked up. These electrical connectors up here, there's like 7mm or 8mm bolts on the inside. The ignition coil or ignition control module, those 2 connectors that sit right here on the module itself. Leave that vapor line up. You still got your fuel lines right here. They need to hook down, but we'll wait on that. On this side, the camshaft positioning sensor, I did earlier in the video reinstall it on the motor. It's better you do not have that sensor there. That way you get the motor up into the body itself and then go ahead and put the sensor back into its position. All right, so that's a little tip when putting the motor back into its hole. And we'll work on getting this motor mount reinstalled. Of course, we're gonna have to get the cherry picker again and lift it right here because it's a little on the low side, so it can get that motor mount back in there. It's right here. And then once we do that, we'll go ahead and get started with the suspension work, with the struts, the shield, the brake components, your rotors, whatnot, and your AC system. So don't forget about that too. All right, coming along with the engine being finalized in the Aurora. You want to double check, make sure your cam positioning sensor is in place. Your motor mount that sits right here, I did forget to tell you, at the beginning, before this motor gets put back in here, you want to ensure that this mount is in its little hole, because if it's not, you're gonna have a hard time trying to get this this mount in here. So ensure that this mount is installed before putting the motor into the proper area. And then after it's installed, of course, it's all 13mm bolts. You have the 4 here, and then you have the long one that runs across. You got your battery box, junction box right here. So you got your cable that runs to the alternator and to the starter. You have your ground. Make sure you get your ground right there. It's important. You have your 2 fan assemblies, your left and right side, and they're held on by those 4 10mm bolts. You have your 2 long ones here, and you have your short one that goes down below the tube right here. Then you have your long coolant hose that runs to the top side of the engine. Your thermostat. Sure you go ahead and, like I was saying, the surface is clean, and the new gasket in place. Put your clamp back on here that runs to the radiator. You got your transmission line. You have your upper one, and you have your lower one down here. That's 16mm. So get that snugged and tight. Then you have your fuel lines hooked back on here. You have to ensure that it clicks. When it clicks, go ahead and put the safety clip back on. You have the one on the low side and the high side. Then you have your throttle cable. It's held on by 3 bolts. You have the 2 bolts on top and you have the 1 bolt on the side. Then you have your evap. Make sure it's locked and clicked in place. And your 2 power box, one right here and one right there. It's 7mm. Make sure you pull it in all the way. And then once you do that, all we have left is the coolant reservoir overflow and your air tube that runs right here. And then down below, you have your struts. So your struts should pretty much fall back into place where you originally pulled it. And then you have your bolts. It's 24mm, 21, and you have your 10mm here and here. So that's your ABS wiring. You're gonna go ahead and plug that back in. Your connector sits in the back of this bar, right? And then on your brake caliper, you might have to pull your piston back into its sleeve so your caliper can actually bolt right back on there. But that's 13mm, and these are 15. The brake caliper brackets are 15mm. So when you go installing this and you pull it tight, ensure that you put some lock thread on there, all right? And then you have your transmission bolts. These 2 bolts right here, it's 15. They're 13mm bolts. So pull that in. Make sure that's in place correctly. Do the same with the other side. The other side should be identical to this except reverse. And then we're ready for the shroud. And also another note, before starting this motor up, let's go ahead and get some fresh motor oil put in place and a brand new oil filter on here before firing it up. So we're gonna go ahead and finish it up with the coolant reservoir, the air tube, and the cover that runs right here, and the beauty cover. Then we should be ready to roll. All right, went ahead and completed an oil filter change. It's best recommended that you go ahead and put fresh oil in here before running the motor. It's 10W30 on these Northstar motors. New oil filter. And looking back here, this is one gasket. It's one of the last gaskets we're going to go ahead and replace on here. The exhaust gasket. This part is about $4 at your parts store. So it's 13mm bolts. Go ahead and pop them on there and just tighten her down, and she should be ready to go ahead and fire it up and test her out. Exhaust piece installed down below. The only remaining parts we have left is that beauty cover that wraps right here and the beauty cover that goes over the motor itself. You want to ensure you top your coolant. All right, your reservoir, fill her up to the proper level after the engine compartment is full. And any other fluids that might have leaked out, if you might have disconnected your power steering lines, you might have to add more fluid. It's good to always double check your transmission fluid while you have it out, your brake fluid. But she should be ready to start now that everything is complete. And the one thing you want to do is, because the engine has been sitting for a while, don't rev the engine up immediately. Yeah, you gotta let the engine oil fluctuate throughout the motor to get the juices flowing before putting some high torque on it. Check for any leaks that might be up underneath there and fix them accordingly. Of course, this is the kit that came out, and we went ahead and replaced it. Of course, you don't see the head gasket, but as you can see, it's pretty late itself. Timing chain really dug into it all. Well, that pretty much completes video number 3 of 3. If you liked my video, please hit the like button. If you like to follow me, please hit the subscribe button down below. And as always, thanks for watching.